All right, hello everyone. I hope you're in the right place. This is Here's the Rub, creating engaging friction between the player and their character. This is a talk about friction. For a lot of people in games, friction is the scariest thing in the world. It's a thing to be avoided at all costs. But in this talk, we're going to break it down. We're going to figure out what it is and how to use it, and specifically how to use it in ways that are not normally done to create friction between the player and the player character. But who am I, and why am I the one giving this talk? My name is Milo Duclayan. I'm a game designer and narrative designer. I've been making games professionally since 2019, where I started writing LARPs in a small program in upstate New York. And since then, I've grown into doing TTRPGs and video games. My first published TTRPG released in 2023 and was nominated for an Indiecade Design Award. And ScribeOS, my video game / LARP, is showcasing here at the Experience and was premiered in Indiepocalypse in 2024. I try my hardest to bring design principles from all of these different game types together into a unified whole. Back to friction. Before we get into things, I want to quickly make a working definition so that we're all on the same page. And here's what we'll go with. So friction, at its simplest, is anything that slows us down and requires some amount of effort that could be physical, emotional, or moral of some kind to overcome. Now, these can come in all different forms, and we'll go through some examples of those in a little bit. But I want to keep those things in mind because they're important to the psychology of friction. So first of all, we've established that friction slows us down and challenges us. So why have it at all, right? Well, it might help us to think about what happens when something is frictionless. Frictionless things are slippery and unmemorable. This is often by design. We don't want to have to actively think about how to, for example, use the controls of our game. So the goal of UI UX is often, not always, to be frictionless. Those are perfectly good reasons to want that, but we don't want it to apply everywhere. In terms of learning things, friction is really necessary. So if there's nothing for our brains to grip onto, we're never going to learn anything. So when it comes to things like educational games or other forms of teaching-based gameplay, like even tutorials, friction is where the fun is. Imagine if there was no friction in a game's combat system, for example, no enemies, no health, and so on. Friction needs to be carefully balanced, too. You want enough to have some grip on the player, but not so much that they can't finish your game, that you don't want to slow them down to that extent. And that will really vary based on your audience. So now that we've established a potential value, the question becomes, where in your game does the friction go? Now, games actually do friction really well. It's sort of the thing they do best. But I want to sort things out to help us understand where we can do things differently, so I will present to you the friction triangle. We've got 3 points on here. We have the character, the player, and the world. And between all of these points, there are opportunities for friction. And there are 2 main types of friction that I want to discuss here. These are bad words for them, but take them for the sake of this talk. I'll call them narrative friction and systemic friction. Some examples of what I mean. So for friction between the character and the world, that's narrative friction. That's your core plot and conflict of the game. For character and world systemic friction, that's your character's stats, progressions, and items. Your character's ability to act on the world. For player-to-world narrative friction, these are things like moral dilemmas or choices that the player makes on the world. It's sometimes we refer to it as player agency. And for player-to-world systemic friction, that's the gameplay. That's your player's strength to act on the game world. But what lies on the point between the character and the player? That's the question. Generally, it's nothing. Most of the time, player-character friction is either ignored or actively worked against. Many traditional TTRPGs aim for player-character bond to be frictionless, in that we are meant to seep entirely and seamlessly into the character in such a way that we can focus on the other frictions, the frictions between us and the world. TTRPGs in particular often encourage GMs to refer to players as their character name, and players are encouraged to say, I do this, not my character does this. In LARP, player PC friction is hard to do because it requires active thought, and that's hard to react to mid-scene. So LARPs often aim to make the player-PC connection as frictionless as possible. And video games often try to sit in that space very heavily. But more than LARP, and even more than TTRPGs, video games give us plenty of affordances to take our time through things. Now again, having no player-PC friction doesn't inherently make these games uninteresting. We tend to get plenty of friction between just the character and the world, or the world and the player. But while removing player-character friction is often framed as increasing immersion, Having the right amount of friction here can actually make game worlds feel much more deep and whole. And they do this by implying a character's interiority, that they have thoughts and ideas beyond what the player projects onto them. Sometimes this is done explicitly, and sometimes by examining the positive and negative space around where the mechanics sit. So what actually is it? Well, it can be a lot of different things, but for the sake of explanation, it might help us to break it down into those two categories we talked about before, the narrative and systemic. Keep in mind, the goal of this friction is to show a character's interiority as separate from the player. So some player-character narrative friction is a kind of pre-written friction built into the framework of the game and existing without player input. These are moments in the game's story where player agency is recognized, but twisted or ignored in some intentional way to emphasize the inner minds of the character. These could be a character's own internal dilemmas or decisions and story elements that make it clear that a character is not bound by the decisions of the player alone. There are actually plenty of games that have done this very well, and part of the reason is that video games have total control over the affordances that they give to the player. If a game wants to decide that a player doesn't get a choice at a certain point, it can do that. One of the most common ways we see this is through dialogue boxes that have no choices that we want to make. This is a great example of May from Night in the Woods deciding what they want to say about themselves in a moment looking in the mirror. And these tell us a lot about the interiority of the main character. A conscious awareness of when we do or don't create this kind of friction tells us a lot about the characters in our game. If every dialogue box looks like this, the friction isn't giving enough leeway to the player to influence the story, and the player might feel shut out. But if the player always has access to every choice they want, they learn a lot less about who the characters are. Figuring out where characters can be malleable and where they're rigid also tells us about their interiority. But what about systemic friction? These are cases where the systems of the game point towards a desire or internal emotion of the character without saying it outright, so that the player can feel it for themselves. Well, we kind of do this player PC friction a lot less in video games because it's a lot more challenging to make it feel rewarding. But in tabletop role-playing games, you don't have that same kind of moment-to-moment control over affordances that video games give you. So in the world of tabletop game design, it's actually flipped. Doing any kind of player PC friction is still generally contained to the indie spaces, but when it appears, you see a lot more of this systemic friction than you do the narrative friction or pre-written friction points. So how does it go in tabletop? Well, again, let's remember that these are ways of emulating a character's interiority, and since systems are most effective at emulating feelings and situations and states, we can show a character's interiority by having our systems show the difference between the player and the character. Let's take a look at an upcoming game called 7-Part Pact, which is designed by J-Dragon, who's out here today. Does a few things with player PC friction that I think work really strongly. Now, first, 7-Part Pact actually does do a bit of narrative friction through the one thing that the designer of a TTRPG actually does have total control over, and that is the game book itself. In 7-Part Pact, it's established that all wizards are men, but to create that friction, the rulebook actually immediately undermines itself, presenting a number of variations where that may not be totally true. 7-Part Pact's rulebooks are full of these mini contradictions that build nuance into the characters and the world while asking us, the player, to deal with the friction these complications create. But 7-Part Pact does quite a bit of systemic friction as well. Let's take one of the game's core mechanics, the domain. Every wizard has a responsibility to watch over their domain, doing various mundane things to maintain the status quo. It works like a mini board game. You don't have to worry too much about the specifics of these. The idea is that each round is a month, and you spend 1 week doing one thing. Now, often rebellious souls in the game will say, what if I don't want to do that? What if I don't want to maintain the status quo? And the game builds this into the rules by allowing players to do pretty much anything they want with their time. But whatever you do that isn't your direct responsibility eats away from the time that you take managing your domain. And if you're not managing your domain, these things start to spiral. This uses the core systems of the game to make us, the player, feel the same friction that the characters are feeling. And the balance between their desires and their social responsibilities to help us connect and understand their inner world better. You might also be noticing that sometimes the barriers between these points on the friction triangle are kind of loose. You could definitely argue that the friction here is coming from the world onto the character, but I'd say that in turn cascades into friction onto the player, because the player and the character share time as a resource. And the player and the character have to meet in the middle. To give an example of a different kind of player PC friction, here's my own upcoming game. It's called We're Never Getting Out of Here. It's an urban horror game about small-town teen drama. Never Getting Out is a deck building game. Each character has a deck of cards representing their confidence in their ability to do things. The deck is something internal to the characters, not just a physical stat. As the game goes on and the horror increases, characters get more and more uncertain and more dead cards are added to their deck. In turn, players find it harder and harder to succeed, creating this emotional harmony. Unlike most deck building games, there are very few ways to slim down your deck, just like there are very few ways to uncomplicate a human teenager. The only way for players to improve their odds is by leaning into the terrible systems encouraged by the world around them. They can either damage their own friendships with each other or lean into the most destructive parts of their personalities. Players generally, not always, do not want to do bad things. But when presented with the systems that encourage and support them, they're far more likely to engage with and recognize those sides of a character. And it can help them understand why a character might act that way and still be able to connect with them instead of creating a mental barrier between them and the bad thing that they've decided to do. So these examples were all TTRPGs, but video games actually give us an easier route to branch out into other genres because we play a role even in games that aren't traditionally defined as RPGs. Any game, for this sake, any game the player has a player character will be a role-playing game to some extent. Additionally, systems in video games can be more complex because they don't need someone tracking and managing them at all times. The computer does it for you, but when we put friction into these systems, it generally should still be visible to players, because if a player doesn't see something, they're less likely to feel it. This is a game called The Longing. It's a game where the PC is a shade waiting a very long time for its master to wake up. The friction here plays on the idea that the player generally wants a game to be done. Unfortunately, the player character has no strong desire to do that. And if left to their own devices, they will complete the game and wake up their master in 400 real-world days. The friction comes in the way that it's really hard to get this PC to shorten that time. There are ways to pass the time, and you can try to find alternate ways to complete the game, none of which are the stated goal of the PC, even though they may get you a rolled credits. The only way to achieve the PC's desire is to wait. One of the best things TTRPGs can remind us is that so many things in games revolve around systems, and we can put friction into any of those systems. The act of opening and playing the game, or in the case of The Longing, even leaving it running in the background, is a system that friction can be added to. There are also games that make good use out of removing friction between the player and the PC. This is a famous Tumblr example from Disco Elysium, showing that a character can be removing friction between the player and PC can be just as valuable because showing that a character is comfortable with something that might be deeply uncomfortable with us as a player. In real life, things that are frictionless are things that we're comfortable in, things that we've done many times before, even things that you could call habitual. Here's a question. Does it say anything about our character in a shooter game that they have very limited friction when it comes to firing a bullet into an enemy's head? Right? It might not, but that's an opportunity for us to say something about a character in these games. I'm not going to talk much about it since it's a very recent game, and I don't want to spoil it for people in here who haven't played it, but there's a new game this year called Titanium Court that engages with friction in a lot of the ways that I've talked about in this talk really well. So if you're interested in some further reading on the subject, I would definitely check this game out. And if you want to hear my thoughts about it and you have played it, you can come find me afterwards. So what? Player PC friction is a tool in our toolkit that can be used to help players think harder about their character, the world, and the narratives they're presented with. Friction helps us slow down. It creates real, memorable characters. Systemic friction can also make complex characters feel more earned. When other characters get mad at the player character for doing bad things, it often doesn't feel earned for the player if it was forced by the game. But if those bad things were built into the game's system, it's far more likely that the complexity will resonate with the player. Another cool thing about friction is that it tends to draw people together. The player and character are both providing friction. They're inevitably going to be pulled towards each other because they're wearing the same shoes. The player will more easily empathize with the character, and the character's actions will often shift towards the will of the player piloting them. This is a really powerful tool for emotional storytelling. I obviously don't have all the answers to how this should be used and what specific ways are the truest to make player-PC friction happen, but I do believe that the more consciously we engage with player-PC friction, the more value we'll be able to get out of it. So as we leave off, I want to try I want you to try to think about what you're choosing to make frictional in your games, and equally important, what you are choosing to make frictionless. Thank you. Here are the games that I referenced during this talk, if you want to check them out. And inspirationally, in the Creekside community Discord, there was discussion that sparked this talk, so shouts out to them. And I can now take some questions and do some answers, if anyone has hands. Yeah, over in the back here.
So this is the thing I've been struggling with, so I don't expect you to have the answer either, but I've been really, like, a lot of the challenges to starting British you're talking about is this idea that the players distinct morality and the characters establish mechanical morality, right?
Yeah.
As you say, like, there's this idea that the player wants to be good, the player wants to take things certain ways,
yeah.
the characters resist it. So how do we navigate what happens when the player doesn't dialogue morally or ethically with the design, right? Like, if you are someone who is comfortable and peaceful with shooting people, then a mechanic where firing the guns with theoretically Call of Duty does not establish itself as friction for anyone except for passing, right? What do we do about that? Right?
Yeah, it's a really interesting challenge, and I actually, in my opinion, that is probably the place where the friction is most important, because when you're communicating with someone who has different, foundational viewpoints from you, games and media present a really powerful tool to express those differences. There's a game, I'm forgetting the name, I'm sure people in here know it. It's the, Spec Ops: The Line, which is a shooter game that is explicitly a shooter game designed for the shooter audience that creates a lot of this friction that's meant to engage with that specific mindset of people. And so I think the key thing is when you're designing friction, you do have to know your audience, or you have to imagine an audience that the friction is targeted towards. You can broaden that audience in various ways, but I think if you are actively going into a game trying to design for people who have that specific difference of viewpoint, it's easier to build points of friction based on the places where you know that they already have assumptions, and then subvert those assumptions or tweak those assumptions in ways that they will be able to understand because it's coming from their own viewpoint. Right? Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
So obviously you don't have all the answers as you said, but do you have anything of like a kind of like litmus test or level of like this is too much friction, this is too little friction?
It's playtesting. I mean, and so here's the problem. The problem is every individual person has their own internal level of friction that is too much for them. And it's impossible to design a game that is going to be the perfect amount of friction for everyone. That's, one of the core challenges of designing a game. But when you're doing this playtesting, you get sort of an aggregate, and you can do playtesting that is with people you know are in your target audience, and tweak over time and slowly sort of get an average that will balance out with them. Yes, it's really fucking hard. It's a real challenge. Yes, over in the back here.
How do you go about intentionally increasing friction for an audience that doesn't think wants it? I feel like people nowadays are very one of the big allures of AI is this idea that it's friction every creative human existence.
Yeah.
So playtesters are probably going to say this is too inconvenient or this is too hard to learn. What if that's how do you sell people on friction?
Yeah. In my mind, there are kind of two ways you can go about it. There's one, which is you can explicitly sort of go say from the start that this is a game where you will experience friction, and then if you set that expectation, the people who engage with your game are generally going to be the people who are willing to engage with it and are willing to take that step over. It's harder if you're trying to do that thing that I mentioned earlier about getting those people with different viewpoints. And I think generally the way to do that is slowly. It's like boiling the frog, right? You don't introduce the friction right away. You start them off with the thing that they're very comfortable with and they can accept very easily. And then you slowly build the layers of friction on top of that. Because players can generally handle, like we talk about with tutorializing for any game. You don't want to give the player all of the systems right up in front. You want to slowly introduce things so that they can wrap their head around it. They can fully get what the system is about before you move on and give them another thing with this cognitive load. And friction works the same way. You can introduce friction slowly until it gets to a point where they are experiencing it and they've you reach their maximum cognitive load, and you go just a little bit higher than that. Yeah. I saw another hand. Oh yes. Last question. And if there are other questions that don't get answered, you can always find me around, and I'm happy to talk about this. Any final question? Yes, over here. Yeah, I mean, okay. There's sort of two parts to that question. The first is if there is ever a time where friction is too much, and yes, absolutely. Like, this is the thing that I was saying about targeting your audience. You're never going to be able to make a game that has the perfect amount of friction for everyone. You can't make a game for everyone. And so knowing the general friction level of your audience is very valuable there. But I think I'm the kind of person that likes engaging with friction that sort of repels me. I think the kind of friction that repels. There was a game that came out semi-recently called Wednesdays, which is a very good game with some very intense themes about child sexual abuse. It's a very frictional game, and there were a lot of moments in that game that I played, and I felt physically and mentally repelled. But that created a very strong emotional weight that I think the game was intending, and was very valuable for my experience playing the game. So I think there's a difference between friction that repels you and friction that makes you stop playing the game. And finding the balance between that is a very hard thing, but is something worth exploring. Yeah. All right, thank you so much for coming.